So after the Beirut's memorandum in 1994, trying to provide clarity around the questions of headscarves in schools, the French government kind of backed off the issue for a couple of years. But because the controversy continued to linger in the early 20th century, in 2003, Jacques Chirac appointed a commission to explore the principle of laïcité, or secularism, in French society in general, in French schools in particular. This commission was led by a guy called Bernard Stassy, and it reported at the end of December 2003, and its conclusions were that headscarves and other prominent symbols of religious display, such as yarmulkes and Sikh turbans, should be banned. They also recommended that there should be a restructuring of the French official public calendar holidays. In particular, they advocated that 2 new holidays, one for Yom Kippur and one for Eid, the Muslim festival celebrating the end of Ramadan, should also be introduced as a way of moving away, because essentially the French school calendar, the holidays were all dictated around older Christian holidays, and as a way of trying to counterbalance that, to offer some non-Christian holidays that could also be celebrated. The French government decided to pass in 2004, based on the recommendations of Stassy's committee, decided to pass laws that enforce these bans on overt religious symbols. They weren't specifically targeted against the headscarf or hijab, but most people understood that that was the main target of the laws. It didn't actually introduce the recommendations on non-Christian holidays, however, so in some ways the kind of trade-off that Stassy had been somewhat proposing didn't even follow through. Not surprising, this provoked a storm of controversy. There was many people protesting. You see here these young girls wearing headscarves, kind of highlighting, in some ways you might argue, the hypocrisy. It's a tough word to say, folks. The hypocrisy of the French state in advocating liberty and equality, and yet denying them the right, as they saw it, to wear headscarves in school. Stassy and others, Stassy in particular, was when asked about this, said that there was forces in France trying to destroy the French Republic, and so he very much saw this as these efforts to introduce or to permit religious symbols in French schools as detrimental to the French national interest. Opinion polls, however, said some different things. They said that a majority of French people, about 70%, supported the ban on religious symbols in school. 80% of teachers, and teachers were some of the most vocal critics of the permission that students had to wear hijabs in class. 80% of teachers supported the ban. Amongst Muslims, perhaps not surprisingly, it was a different story. A small majority of Muslims were in favour of the ban. But interestingly, and one might argue again, perhaps not surprisingly, it was only a majority of Muslim women supported the ban as well. So the issue of clothing and Muslim identity in France, while solved in relation to the headscarves in school, continues to actually be a kind of ongoing source of controversy in France to this day. One of the other big issues the French state had to deal with in the early 2000s was the fact, and not France was not alone in this regard, there were lots of countries that as their baby boomer populations began to age, the generous social security benefits and state benefits that had been allocated when this population was young, supporting an older population, was now becoming a problem, because essentially the numbers of people following behind the younger generations, there weren't enough of them paying tax at the current level to support all the benefits that had been given to elderly French people in particular. And this was a challenge for the French state to try and tackle. It tried to introduce, under Prime Minister Raffarin, tried to introduce some tax cuts and some modest spending cuts to compensate for this. Perhaps the most significant change they did was to raise the retirement age in France up to 62, which itself produced a lot of backlash. The French retirement, France in particular, had a problem, because going back to the Mitterrand government of the 1980s, the Mitterrand government had encouraged early retirement as a way of trying to create new jobs for French people. By raising the retirement age, they were trying to keep people in work longer, meaning that they would have to pay less in order to support them in their retirement. A lot of young people in particular protested the raising of the minimum retirement age in France, not because they were worried about having to work too long, but precisely because, as the Mitterrand government had argued, by forcing early retirement, you open up more jobs for new people. So that was the French state is trying to wrestle with issues of identity in schools, certainly trying to struggle its way to resolving the fiscal imbalance it had in terms of it basically was spending more money than it had, and trying to support the very generous benefits that had been given to French citizens during previous government administrations. The United Nations, the European Union, however, continued to progress towards greater integration. Oftentimes with France being a leading member of this push for integration. And in fact, in 2004, the 25 members of the European Union had agreed to create a constitution. So they created a constitution. The major change the constitution was going to implement was to, in certain areas, because traditionally the European Union had functioned that all member states had to agree, there had to be unanimous decisions in order to make a change. The new constitution was mostly proposing that in some areas, not all, but in some, a simple majority vote amongst the countries as opposed to unanimous votes would be enough to make a change. Of course, we remember Jacques Chirac was very much anti-European Union, or at least something of a Eurosceptic early in his political career. But he decided, so basically all countries of the European Union had to ratify this constitution. And some countries, like Ireland, were legally bound that they had to put this to a national referendum for the population to decide. France did not have that requirement. It did have a long tradition of consulting the French public on matters of the European Union. And most of the opinion polls in 2004, before this referendum was held, showed that the vast majority of French people would be happy to support the European Constitution. So Chirac decided, whose own public opinion poll numbers weren't doing so good, decided that this was kind of an easy win for him to put this to a referendum, and that his own image would be kind of boosted by a victory for the yes side. And so that's what he did. He offered it to a referendum for the French people to be held in 2005. However, as the day of polling grew closer, it became obvious that opposition to the constitution was stronger than Chirac had imagined. There were forces, on the one hand, on the right, Jean-Marie Le Pen and other people, in some ways echoing what Chirac himself had said in the early 1980s, who argued that this was undermining French sovereignty and therefore was a bad thing. But there were also forces on the left who were concerned that the European Union was becoming nothing more than a defender of big business interests and was not really promoting policies that benefited ordinary people. And so when the referendum was held, it was actually an embarrassing defeat for Chirac. 55% of the French people voted against it. The constitution had to be, well, in the short term, scrapped. I mean, basically, most of the elements of the constitution were reintroduced in the Lisbon Treaty, which was signed 4 or 5 years later. But an embarrassing defeat for Chirac as well. He replaced his Prime Minister Raffarin with Dominique Le Villepin as a kind of effort to restart his government in the face of this defeat. If Chirac thought 2005 that was the worst thing that was going to happen to him in 2005, he was to be sadly disappointed. Because so this is just a breakdown. You see most parts of France, apart from Western France, and Strasbourg in the east, which of course is the European Union city itself, were opposed to the referendum. So in the fall of 2005, there was an incident that took place in a Parisian suburb, so Clichy-sous-Bois, which is in eastern Paris, primarily made up of immigrant population. On October 27, 2005, French police responded to reports of a break-in at a building site. And there was a bunch of teenage kids from the area hanging around the building site. When they saw the police car, they all ran away. 3 of the young boys ran into an electricity substation as they were trying to hide themselves from the police. And unfortunately, they were all electrocuted, and 2 of them died as a result of their injuries. And this led to a controversy initially because the idea was that, well, why would young boys risk hiding themselves in a highly dangerous electrical substation, other than the fact that they knew that the French police oftentimes are quite brutal to teenagers they apprehended, especially immigrant teenagers, and this sparked riots. So starting that night and over the next 3 or 4 nights, riots broke out across Clichy-sous-Bois and began to spread into the rest of Paris. So as more and more people participated in riots, it essentially became a contest between immigrant groups in France and the French state and the French police in particular. So these riots oftentimes grew quite violent. On several of these nights, there was hundreds of cars burnt out, initially in Paris. So you can see here, this is the spread of the riots, first from Clichy-sous-Bois and then to the rest of Paris, then to all the other major urban centres in France, where many French immigrants and descendants of immigrants kind of expressed their frustration at their unemployment and the kind of poor conditions they lived in the French society. There were some fatalities as well. One man was beaten up by protesters and was killed. Another woman was doused in gasoline and set on fire. I mean, she was lucky to survive. But there was a great deal of brutality involved with some of these riots. Nicolas Sarkozy was the French Minister for the Interior. He was the favourite to replace Chirac as president in 2007. He basically said that those who were participating in the riots were a rabble, or it could be translated basically as scum. And he said that these districts needed to be chemically cleaned afterwards, which not surprisingly didn't do much to kind of tamper down a highly tense situation in France. So I want to show you a map that kind of gives you a sense of just basically these riots spread across France over the next 2 or 3 weeks and lead to a great deal of violence. So just you see the spread starting in, and you see the key here on the right. So this is mostly tracking riots in terms of how many cars are being burned out, and especially in comparison to the day before. On November 8th, Jacques Chirac declared a state of emergency and extended curfew hours, which did do something to kind of weaken the riots, and they petered out eventually by mid-November. But again, a sign that France was still coming to terms with its largely Muslim immigrant population that was finding itself, for a variety of reasons, unable to integrate, in the French minds sometimes unwilling to integrate, into a wider French identity. Nor was this to be the end of the riot. So I mentioned that De Villepin replaced Raffarin as Prime Minister in 2005 in order to try and create more jobs in French society. De Villepin proposed a new law in 2006 called the Equal Opportunity Law. What it basically meant was that any French employer who hired a new employee under 26 years of age, they would be able to fire them without an awful lot of restrictions in the first 2 years of employment. French workers had a great deal of legal protection from the French state. This was trying to dilute some of those protections in order to encourage more businesses to hire more people, because they wouldn't be essentially stuck with a bad worker for the rest of that person's life if they hired someone based on current French laws. Not surprisingly, French young people didn't kind of take kindly to the fact that their economic rights or their labour rights were being watered down, because obviously the law would affect them disproportionately. And there was massive protests across France in the spring of 2006, including in universities. About 68 of France's 99 universities went on strike. Some demonstrations, there was one demonstration on March 18th in Paris that had 700,000 people attend. That turned violent. Protests were also held on April 4th, with, depending on your estimate, somewhere between 1 and 3 million people taking part in protests across France. And essentially, the Villepin government realised they had to back down in the face of this kind of massive student protest and water down those laws. So, from the point of view of French students, this was a victory, because most of their legal rights as workers were protected. French business obviously saw this as a defeat, because it meant it's very difficult in France for businesses to fire people for a variety of reasons, which makes French businesses wary about hiring new employees. So the last couple of years of Jacques Chirac's presidency were kind of marred by, as we saw, riots, scandals, concerns. Chirac himself had a stroke in 2005, which obviously hindered a minor stroke, but a stroke nonetheless, and he decided not to run for president again in 2007. His public image actually had an upward swing for a period of time after his presidency, especially because he was replaced by Sarkozy, who proved not to be a particularly popular president himself. But in 2011, Chirac was put on trial for crimes dating back to when he was mayor of Paris. Essentially, he had been allegedly giving jobs to members of his political party, putting them on the municipal payroll in Paris for jobs that didn't even exist at all. He had been protected from prosecution while he was president of France, but that protection obviously ran out after his presidency ended. And in 2011, he was convicted of 2 of these charges. He was given a 2-year suspended sentence, and it kind of was an inglorious end to his political career, because he became only the second French head of state, after Marshal Philippe Pétain, not exactly an example you want to be following, to be convicted of a crime. So that brought Chirac's political career to an end, and kind of brings us to the end of this class, with France stepping into the new millennium, and yet still facing with several issues dating back from several decades before.